Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Just a few words. This week's Torah portion, Shmini, and I began the service saying I was waxing nostalgic tonight. Shmini was my senior sermon at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio, back in 1986. And I've always wrestled with it. Sam, we talked a lot about your Torah portion, and you're going to teach us tomorrow that there's some upsetting things in your Torah portion. It tells the strange and disturbing tale of Aaron's sons Nadav and Abihu, who offered up what the Torah says is Eish Zara, a strange or a foreign fire, on the newly consecrated altar in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan. And God was angry at their action, and God sends a bolt of lightning down from heaven, which incinerates them on the spot. Now, the text does not really provide us with any context or motive, either for Aaron's sons or really for God's severe punishment, but our commentators have offered up many potential scenarios, ranging from Nadav and Abihu's greed or desire for power, or to the suggestion that they were drunk when they approached the altar. But truth be told, none of those explanations offered up by the rabbis works for me. And every time I read the passage, I struggle to find a meaningful lesson. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this passage occurs just after Nadav and Abihu's death. In Leviticus 10, verse 3, we find the following: Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, hu asher diber Adonai lemor bekrovai akadesh va'al pnei kol ha'am achabed vayidom Aharon. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what Adonai meant by saying, through those near to me I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people. And then it says, and Aaron was silent. Vayidom Aharon. These last two words, Vayidom Aharon and Aaron was silent, have always haunted me. Truly, for a father to be silent when his two beloved sons are slaughtered in front of him is inconceivable to me. And God makes it even more difficult immediately following the silence, when God commands Aaron not to mourn or display any outward signs of grief following his loss. This is such a difficult passage. How could God have commanded him not to grieve, to keep silent? And how could Aaron have complied with this request? Staying silent in the midst of horror is antithetical to everything I believe in. This past week, in preparation for the Oscars this Sunday, Sue and I have been, well, she's been watching many more, but as many nominated movies as we could. And the other night we watched the movie Belfast. And for those who have not yet seen it, the film tells the pseudo-autobiographical story of writer, director, producer Kenneth Branagh's childhood growing up in the city of Belfast in the 1960s. We see the evolution of the Civil War, known as the Troubles, that decimated Northern Ireland for more than 2 decades with horrible consequences. And without giving away too much of the plot, there's one scene in the film where the main character, a 9-year-old boy, supposedly Branagh, named Buddy, gets caught up in a rampaging mob and runs into a supermarket where he steals a box of laundry soap. When his mother sees the box of soap in her son's hand and he returns home, she is furious. She marches with him back to the store in the midst of a violent riot, mind you, and demands that he return his ill-gotten goods, risking her life and his in the process. And it's a powerful, defining moment in the film. It's clear that Branagh's message was that his mother instilled a moral compass within him that made him who he is today. A key message of the film is that war and conflict depend on 2 factors. Number one, the demonization or dehumanization of the other, allowing enemies to disregard the humanity of those whom they attack. And number two, that good people have an impact when they speak up, when they live their values. Silence and avoidance were not an option for Buddy's mother. She understood that if she stayed silent, if she did not say something and force her son to return his ill-gotten gains, there was a chance that he would never learn the vital lesson of refusing to allow the passions of others to blind him to his own moral compass. Silence and inaction were not an option. So the question of when we should be silent and when we need to speak out is one with which I wrestle on an almost daily basis. As a rabbi, I occupy this pulpit, which affords me a platform from which to speak about any issues that I feel compelled to share. And during my 35 years in the rabbinate, I have found myself tied to multiple causes and issues that by necessity I have promoted or condemned. Support for the state of Israel, condemnation of racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism, challenging the gun lobby's shameful propaganda and neglect of public safety when they promote weapons whose only purpose is to kill and harm other human beings, ensuring access to health care and abortion rights for those who can become pregnant, addressing our nation's history of racial intolerance, and working for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our congregation and our community, the pollution and despoliation of our air and water, and so many others. And sometimes, believe it or not, people have disagreed with me. And sometimes my words have been perceived as controversial, and I have had many powerful and sometimes difficult conversations with members of the communities I have served who disagreed with what they felt was my overstepping my rabbinic role and treading into political waters, where some felt I did not belong. And I've always believed that when I or any of our clergy address an issue from the pulpit, the root cause of the address must never be political, but rather it should be based on Jewish values and their application. And if this belief has caused some to see me or others crossing a line, so be it. Usually, not always, but usually in the course of a conversation following a sermon or an article that I wrote that someone felt was too political, the ensuing dialogue, while not necessarily changing each other's minds, nonetheless brought us closer together when we realized that despite the fact that our approaches might be different, we still have the same vision for a better world. We could not be silent. We could agree to disagree and still care for one another. But there are other times, however, when this was not possible on rare and very few occasions. This has meant that we may have lost a member of our community, which always saddens me, but sometimes it cannot be helped. As we look at events happening around the world this evening, it is clear that there are voices that need to be amplified. Silence can be seen as complicity when those whose actions are so clearly immoral that the act of not speaking out can be seen as a tacit endorsement. History has taught us that our nation's silence, for example, in the face of Nazi Germany's march toward totalitarianism, was perceived as a green light to Hitler and his genocidal agenda. And today, when we see the devastation wrought by Vladimir Putin's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine, when we see the faces of the mourners, the injured, and displaced refugees who number in the millions as they flee to Poland, Romania, Moldova, and Slovakia, leaving everything they knew behind, when we hear the lies of Russian propaganda machine echoed by some in our own nation, silence is not an option. I am proud of our president for his strong leadership and condemnation of Vladimir Putin's despotism. And likewise, watching the Supreme Court confirmation hearings this past week for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson brought a mix of emotions ranging from joy to disgust, as the process designed to ensure democratic values in our nation devolved into right-wing and racist talking points. I cannot remain silent. And when elected officials of our nation promote a false narrative of a stolen election, when the spouse of a Supreme Court justice is found to have worked behind the scenes to overturn an election, and voices of concern and condemnation are silenced, no one should remain silent. Now, friends, there are multiple avenues available to us to help support Ukrainian refugees. They are listed in our website, our bulletin, our e-notes, and on the web. And if you have not already sent donations to support those in need, now is the time. Inaction is also a form of silence. Aaron's silence in the face of tragedy, his own personal loss and that of the people he served, cannot and must not be a role model for leadership in today's world. Like the brave mother in the film Belfast, who demanded that her child refuse to get caught up in the senseless violence that surrounded her family. There are defining moments in our lives that call upon us and test our strength, our character, and our resolve to see and manifest goodness in the world, even when everything around us seems to be falling into an abyss of apathy and self-absorption. And so on this Shabbat, when we hear of Aaron's silence, let us resolve to use our voices to bring holiness into the world. And when that is not possible, to call out injustice whenever and wherever it occurs. Aaron's silence is not the answer. Shabbat Shalom.